Excellent. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining. I think we will start, and as people come through, we can just admit them from the lobby. It's great to be here with you all today. Before we kick off officially, I just wanted to go over a little bit of housekeeping. So you've all been muted automatically, but please do, if you come on mute, please do mute yourselves during the call. You can choose to keep your cameras on or off for the session as you prefer. Many of us are still working from home, and we understand that interruptions may happen from children and pets, so please do feel free to step away from your computer if you need to. The session is being recorded for those who can't make it today. The session will run for about 45 minutes in total, so that's about 30 minutes on the presentation side of things, and then 15 minutes for Q&A at the end. So please do raise your hand or put your questions in the chat box, and I will moderate them at the end of the session. If you have any technical issues at all, please do feel free to write that in the chat box, or send Rosie or Evie or myself a message, and we will endeavour to rectify them as soon as possible. So first off, I just wanted to introduce the KnowTheChain team, as it's always nice to put a face to a name that you're going to be seeing over the next few months. My name is Anya, and I'm the head of KnowTheChain and investor strategy for the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre, together with researcher and Business and Human Rights Resource Centre representative Rosie Monaghan and researcher Evie Clark, who's no relation. We make up the KnowTheChain team. So we believe, obviously, that engagement is a vital tool in unlocking better practice. So while, of course, we will be in touch with you over the next couple of months, please do reach out to us as well if you have any questions or feedback on the benchmark process, timeline, or methodology. A lot of those things we'll hope to clear up for you today. So before we get into the changes to the methodology, it's always worth restating what the purpose and mission of KnowTheChain is. So we believe that companies and investors can be a powerful force in changing the conditions under which people work in their global supply chains. Thus, we are committed to helping companies make an impact in their fight to eradicate forced labour. We use benchmarking as a tool to identify and share best practices, and as a way to harness the competitive nature of markets to create a race to the top that encourages companies to adopt standards and practices that protect workers' well-being. So KnowTheChain works with project partners Sustainalytics, Verite, and Humanity United to benchmark corporate practices in 3 high-risk sectors: the ICT sector, the food and beverage, and the apparel and footwear sector. So since 2016, KnowTheChain has produced 9 separate benchmarks on 129 companies across all those sectors. The KnowTheChain investor statement is signed by more than 160 investors with over 6 trillion in assets under management. And we work closely with investor organizations like the PRI, the Interfaith Centre on Corporate Responsibility, and the Investor Alliance for Human Rights to improve investor knowledge and investor company engagement on the issues surrounding forced labour. We also work very closely with the Fair Labour Association and the Responsible Business Alliance. So to set the scene then, why change the methodology? Well, KnowTheChain has long been a leading benchmark for tracking corporate practice around forced labour and human rights within the global supply chains. We are now in the 4th cycle of benchmarks and have seen many companies make progress in terms of their public commitments to human rights and ending modern slavery, but little evidence of how they implement those policies or whether they're achieving those stated outcomes. So the issues surrounding the measurement of outcomes and impacts are compounded by the changing legal context and due diligence and increasingly robust voluntary and mandatory sustainability reporting requirements. The reality is that human rights due diligence is no longer optional. So France and the Netherlands have already passed laws requiring companies to undertake human and/or labour rights due diligence. The EU, Norway, and Germany are also completing similar efforts. The IFRS's Sustainability Standards Board metrics will be voluntary in name only, as already the UK and China have committed to adopting those framework within their own disclosure regimes. And the SEC is also working on disclosure rules on climate and supply chain practices. As a result, companies face increasing accountability stemming from business relationships that undermine human rights, such as lawsuits, complaints through national contact points at the OECD, shareholder resolutions, social protests, or worse. Courts have also started using the UNGPs to inform rulings and find companies liable for human rights impacts. In addition, the US has significantly increased its efforts to block the import of products made with forced labor and has taken bold action by banning imports for several of the largest global suppliers. Canada and Mexico have also agreed to ban imports of goods made from forced labor, and similar approaches are being considered in the EU, Australia, and the UK and Canada are reviewing export controls. So on the other hand, companies that are transparent around issues and engage with their suppliers and workers across their supply chain are reaping reputational rewards. Consumers are increasingly voting with their feet when it comes to purchasing. New analysis by Just Capital, a platform for measuring and improving corporate performance in the stakeholder economy, provides evidence that US companies performing best on the priorities of the American public, including worker treatment, fair pay, and ethical leadership, generate significantly greater investment returns and exhibit reduced investment risk than their lower performing counterparts. So the moral argument notwithstanding, it is in the enlightened self-interest of companies to care for their workers across their entire value chain. But that's enough of an introduction from me. I will hand over to my colleague, Evie, who will now take us through how we conduct our research and a little bit more about the changes that we've implemented this year. Thanks, Evie.
Thank you so much, Anya. So I wanted to first run through the sources used for our research. KnowTheChain's benchmark research is based on English language public disclosure from company websites, and we also allow companies the opportunity to provide us with additional disclosure after they have had a chance to review our initial research. And this additional disclosure will be made publicly available on the KnowTheChain website. But at the same time, companies are also encouraged to publish any relevant disclosure on their own websites. We also include publicly available forced labor allegations from third-party sources, as well as company responses to allegations. And finally, we carry out third-party verification with particular organizations such as the Responsible Business Alliance and the Fair Labor Association. In terms of company selection, KnowTheChain selects companies for our benchmarks in collaboration with one of our partners, Sustainalytics. So we include the largest global publicly traded companies by market cap, also taking into consideration the percentage of revenue derived from own branded products. So in addition, for the 2022-23 round of benchmarks, company selection also took into account a rebalancing on the basis of locations where companies are headquartered, as well as sub-industry groups, just to ensure some greater representation across these areas as well. So for our 2022-23 round of benchmarks, we're assessing 185 companies, 60 in ICT, 60 in food and beverage, and 65 in the apparel and footwear sector. And in terms of regional distribution of company headquarters, you can see that for ICT, we're including 24 Asian companies, 10 European companies, 26 North American companies, food and beverage, 17 Asia Pacific companies, 15 European companies, 4 Latin American companies, and 24 North American companies. And for apparel and footwear, 3 African companies, 15 Asian companies, 20 European companies, 2 Latin American companies, and 25 North American companies. And just on this slide, so here is an example of our benchmark timeline. This particular timeline is for the ICT benchmark, but the timelines for all three benchmarks are outlined on our website. So we're currently in this initial research phase, so undertaking a thorough review of all ICT company websites and setting our research against our revised methodology, which we'll go into further later in our slides. So as mentioned, once we send out our initial research to companies from June onwards, companies will have an opportunity to review our research and pinpoint any additional relevant materials, which we'll then incorporate into our final research. And we'll also at this time send out a reporting guidance to companies with further detail on our approach and scoring and examples of company practice. So our ICT benchmark ranking and accompanying report and company scorecards will be published between November and December of 2022. For food and beverage, this benchmark is due to be published in Q2 of 2023, and for the apparel and footwear sector, the benchmark is due to be published in Q4 of 2023. And looking at the next slide, so KnowTheChain has been benchmarking companies in the three sectors that we cover every 2 years since 2016, beginning with 20 companies and increasing the number of companies being assessed to 60 per sector. And this allows us to compare year on year where companies are making progress, but also the areas in which progress is stagnant. And across sectors, we have seen some notable improvements. So looking at the companies that have been benchmarked repeatedly, it's very positive to see that the majority of companies now have a no-fee policy, for example, but it's also time to move beyond that to implementation and ensuring prevention and remediation of fee payment for workers. In certain key areas, we're not seeing the necessary progress in company practice in a way that addresses the conditions faced by workers. So looking in particular at these 4 areas highlighted on the slide, for purchasing practices, for example, companies should really be adopting and disclosing responsible purchasing practices, including improving forecasting alignments, ring fencing labor costs, and disclosing data points such as the minimum or average lead time provided to suppliers, and disclosing the percentage of orders changed after an order is placed. For worker voice, companies should really be working with local or global trade unions to support freedom of association in their supply chains, signing enforceable labor rights agreements, and providing concrete examples of how they improved freedom of association for their suppliers' workers. And companies should also be disclosing data on their grievance mechanisms to show that they are used and trusted by workers, as well as ensuring that they are available to workers below the first tier. In terms of remedy, companies should ensure that they engage with affected stakeholders, disclose outcomes of remedy for suppliers' workers, as well as evidence that remedies are satisfactory to affected workers. However, in looking at company progress to date throughout the 3 sectors, we also see some gaps in what is considered to be even baseline human rights due diligence steps. So for example, 72% of companies do not disclose an example of engaging with relevant stakeholders, such as policymakers, worker rights organizations, or local NGOs. And 36% of companies across the 3 sectors do not disclose conducting human rights risk assessments as part of their overall human rights due diligence approach. And just to provide some background and detail on some of the key changes to our methodology, which Rosie will go into further. So between every benchmark cycle, KnowTheChain revises its methodology to ensure that the benchmarks focus on indicators which represent the key drivers of change. So over the last number of months, we have consulted with key stakeholders to incorporate feedback from a representative sample of stakeholders, including the Fair Labour Association and the Responsible Business Alliance. And in 2022-23 assessments, we will focus on a core set of key themes, which are articulated in a smaller subset of KnowTheChain's previous methodology. And some of the changes include a reduced focus and weight given to policies, and enhanced focus on implementation of processes, as well as on outcomes for workers. We also adjusted the weighting of particular indicators. So whereas previously all themes and indicators were weighted equally, the weighting of indicators has been adjusted to give some increased credit for disclosure that demonstrates implementation and outcomes for workers similarly. Also, another change is that stakeholder engagement is now integrated throughout the methodology, as opposed to being assessed in one single indicator. And similarly, action on lower tiers has been integrated throughout the methodology. And I'll now pass it over to Rosie, who will dive deeper into the methodology changes.
Thanks, Evie, and thanks very much, everybody, for taking the time to join us today. Those of you who are already familiar with our methodology will know that we have 7 themes in our benchmark, which are broadly based on the UNGPs, covering commitment, due diligence, and remedy. We've retained these 7 themes in this version of the methodology. There are just fewer indicators measured under each theme, between 1 and 3 indicators under each theme. We're still looking at whether companies have a supplier code of conduct and internal management, training and capacity building under commitment and governance, and then various forms of risk identification and assessment, risk mitigation and prevention are covered under themes 2 to 6. Under remedy, we're looking for a company's remedy process and also examples of remedy outcomes for workers in your supply chains. So Evie mentioned there about how we've sought to increase our focus on companies' implementation of policies and processes. So this indicator is one example of how we've done so. We're looking at 3 different elements under the recruitment fee indicator. Firstly, a policy, which is an area that we've seen improvements in across sectors. In the ICT sector, it's now commonplace for companies to have a policy prohibiting worker-paid fees. Secondly, the implementation of that policy and how fees are being prevented. So, for example, mapping recruitment costs, understanding recruitment channels, undertaking due diligence of labour agencies, or giving examples of how suppliers have either paid or eliminated fees. And lastly, remediation under the third element there, where that policy is breached. So here we would look for examples of fee repayment to workers. And on the next slide, we wanted to also share some good examples of company disclosure that we've seen previously. So that really explains the effect or the impact of a policy or process. So taking HP, first of all, moving away from the topic of recruitment fees, HP had disclosed a process on purchasing practices, stating that they'd supported suppliers to improve forecasting ability and work on tracking working hours. It's good to know that a company is working on responsible purchasing practices, and then even better to understand how effective those are. So in this instance, HP disclosed that this resulted in a change for workers' shifts or working hours. Taking an example from the apparel sector, Lululemon gave a good level of detail on how it's implementing its policy prohibiting worker-paid recruitment fees. It described its program in Taiwan and was the only company to give examples of how different suppliers had implemented responsible recruitment processes that demonstrated how its policies manifest in practice. It also described capacity building processes through working group sessions, conducted assessments of recruitment agencies used by suppliers, and disclosed the scope of that as well by explaining how many agencies were assessed. And if we move to the next slide. So to touch on how we've adjusted weighting for indicator elements, we've included a couple of examples here. So, for instance, an indicator element looking at process or remedy process on the left here would be worth 20% of the total indicator score, whereas disclosure that gives examples of outcomes for workers is worth more, i.e. the outcomes of a remedy process. Similarly with recruitment fees, which we've just talked through, the policy is worth 20% and the other efforts that relate to the implementation or the enforcement of that policy or outcomes for workers are worth 80% collectively. And if we move to the next slide. So Evie mentioned that we've integrated stakeholder engagement more strongly throughout the methodology, as opposed to having a standalone indicator measuring stakeholder engagement, which is what we had in place previously. And this is in line with CHRB's changes to their methodology also. So here is one example from our responsible recruitment indicator. For full points, a company should demonstrate how it's worked with relevant stakeholders on supporting responsible recruitment in its supply chains. Examples of what we would be looking for under this element are not restrictive, but could include using responsible recruitment agencies, supporting the development of ethical recruitment schemes, sharing due diligence findings on recruitment issues, or engaging policymakers to improve standards for labour recruiters. Under other indicators, we also would look for information on stakeholders engaged, for example, in the assessment of risk or steps taken to address risks, engagement with unions specifically on supporting freedom of association in supply chains, whether workers or their legitimate representatives are involved in the design or performance of grievance mechanisms. So moving on to lower tier efforts, our focus on the steps that companies are taking beyond the first tier isn't an entirely new theme. We've just reassessed how it's been integrated. So rather than being assessed under its own indicator element in the methodology, it's now integrated within certain indicator elements. So some examples of where we look at steps beyond the first tier are on the slide here, so including traceability efforts, forced labour risks identified in different tiers of supply chains, the percentage or number of migrant workers at first tier, but then also taking into account any information companies have beyond that, and the availability of grievance mechanisms beyond the first tier. And on the next slide, we have some good practice examples that we saw last year of how companies were taking steps to address risks beyond the first tier. So Intel had disclosed remediation that had taken place in the second and third tier of its supply chains. Adidas had reported on the availability of a grievance mechanism to workers at second tier and at farm level. And HPE reported on training for indirect suppliers with a view to extending its programs beyond the first tier. A couple of other examples which are not included on this slide. So in relation to disclosing risks identified across tiers, Tesco had identified forced labour risks in relation to coffee, cocoa, palm oil, prawns and wild fish, and reported that these risks were highest in the lower tiers of its supply chains. Additionally reported that it pays particular attention to Spanish salads and Italian tomatoes because of the known forced labour risks at the farm level in these commodities. Nestle had reported lower tier monitoring across multiple commodities, for example, to farm level in its hazelnut supply chains, and also on Thai seafood vessels in partnership with the Isra Institute and at Indonesian palm oil mills and estates. So I'm actually going to wrap up there now, and I'll hand back to Anya to take us through any questions you might have.